Hello again. My name is David Wilkins, and I'm from ASALH. Understand from Ms. Sherrill that you all are going to be discussing the Three-Fifths Compromise as you continue your study on the American Constitution. I wanted to take just a few minutes, show you a clip in a moment, but talk a little bit about the importance of the Three-Fifths Compromise. There are a number of important compromises that will come out of the 1787 Constitutional Convention. But I wanted to give you a little perspective as you think about the formation of our nation's government. First and foremost, we need to always keep in mind that slavery was legal for about 150 years before that Constitutional Convention met in 1787. The Constitution, as it will be finalized, will protect slavery in a number of significant ways. The Three-Fifths Compromise is perhaps the most important of those protections. And those were protections for wealthy landowners and their right to own property in men, women, and children of African descent. So we shouldn't ever lose sight of the fact that slavery was a key determinant driver of the economy at the time and was on the minds of the founding fathers as they met in Philadelphia. Indeed, there were more than 500,000 enslaved men, women, and children in the colonies at the time of the Revolutionary War and the meeting in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. And these were enslaved men, women, and children in the North and in the South. That's not often remembered, but we can't ever lose sight of the fact that slavery was a national and not merely a Southern reality. And that slavery was indeed central to the economies of all of the colonies, again, North and South. Certainly in the South, over the next 100 years following the Revolution, slavery would become more important with the emergence of the cotton economy. It would decline in importance in the North being more industrial, less agricultural, and therefore less for need of large amounts of unpaid labor. Slavery was first and foremost an institution of power designed to create profit for the enslavers. You may have images from other classes, other experiences, your own reading. Never lose sight of the fact that first and foremost, this was an institution of power wielded by wealthy landowners, many of whom were at that meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, and they were there to protect their interest in human beings. Now, not all the people of African descent were enslaved. Before the Revolutionary War, after the Revolutionary War, there were always small numbers of free people of color in both the North and the South. Some of these people would have come to the colonies as free people. Most of them would have come as enslaved people who over time were free, either buying their freedom, running away from their enslaver and claiming their freedom, or being emancipated. And we will see a difference between the practices in the North after the Revolutionary War. Some of the northern states will begin to emancipate on a gradual basis. That's why it's referred to as gradual emancipation. They will gradually emancipate more older enslaved people. They would keep in slavery certainly for most men, able-bodied men to about the age of 25. Philadelphia will be the first of the northern states to pass a gradual emancipation bill. The other states would follow, but very, very slowly. And forms of slavery would continue well into the late part of the 19th century, the 1800s, late 1800s. Free people of color and some enslaved people fought in the Revolutionary War. They fought as well in the Civil War, but you need to understand that people of African descent fought in every war that America engaged in, beginning with the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Civil War, and every war thereafter. That's a fact that's unfortunately lost on many. The irony, of course, is that in most of these wars, like the Revolutionary War, the initial resistance by, like George Washington, was not to recruit. But once the British started encouraging enslaved men to run away and join their forces, promising them freedom, Washington realized that that was a resource that he needed. And therefore, he acceded to the recruitment of, again, Black free people of color and enslaved men who were willing to fight. There were more than, at the time of the war, about 500,000 enslaved men, women, and children in the colonies. To give you some perspective in terms of the numbers, more than 100,000 enslaved people either escaped, died, or were killed in the war. And that loss of property, never lose sight of the fact that these enslaved people were viewed as property. Chattel slavery is the term we give to the kind of slavery that existed for almost 250 years in this country. And again, a tragically large number of them lost their lives attempting to escape, killed during the war, or successfully escaping, either to fight for the British and then ultimately, in many instances, gain their freedom in Canada or other places under the control of the British Empire. You might be interested to know that one of the first acts, if not the first act of the new government under the Constitution, was the passage of the Northwest Territories Act in 1789, I believe. What's interesting about this is the territories not a part of the 13 colonies to the west of the then colonial, what would become the United States. Indeed, the area around what we call the Great Lakes. So I'm from Illinois, spent a lot of time in Michigan, have a son in Indiana. All of these, what would become states, are part of the Northwest Territory. And there was a prohibition against slavery as a part of the passage of the Northwest Territory Bill. This issue of limiting the expansion of slavery would continue to plague the new United States up and through the Civil War. Indeed, it would be one of the key issues that would lead to the Civil War in 1861 over the South's desire to expand slavery into the Western territories and the North's determination that slavery, while legal and allowed to exist where it existed, was not going to be expanded. And that was, again, just one of the several tensions that would lead to the ultimate tragic Civil War. The last point I'll make before we get to the video on the 3/5 compromise is, as the founding fathers gathered and discussed and debated the Constitution, they obviously had the Declaration of Independence in place for 2 or 3 years before that time. And the language of the Declaration you could consider as a guide star for them. The point I want to make is, as we consider the all men are created equal language we find in the Declaration, that did not include people of color, whether free or enslaved. And so we need to think about these issues, the issue of slavery, how it was viewed, how people of color were treated, both free and enslaved, as at the same time You have our founding fathers meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, wrestling with these very, very important issues of freedom and liberty and property. People of color, people of African descent, were considered property. They were not considered men, which then leads to this issue that we confront in the 3/5 compromise. So let me share my screen, show this quick video, and we'll conclude this session for Mrs. Sherrill's class.
Guys, I almost missed you. It's Hiphu's history, and we're going to do a little bit of the teaching on the YouTubes. Are you ready for some 3/5 compromise? Because it's going to be on the exam. It's important vocabulary for an American government course, a U.S. history course, or the course of life. How do you like that? The 3/5 compromise, batter up. All right, guys, Philadelphia, baby. Hoot, hoot. Philly, 1787. We have the Constitutional Convention going on, and we are really, at first, amending the Articles of Confederation, and eventually we toss that bad boy out and we start anew. And one of the compromises that occurs before the 3/5 compromise is called the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And of course, you've already learned that. This is what created a bicameral legislature, a House and a Senate. Remember the Senate, 2 senators per state, and the small states are like, I love it. And then we have a House of Reps based on population. And the large states are like, I love it. And now we can get ready for the 3/5 compromise. Because in order to determine a state's representation for the House of Reps, we need to know their population. So the Constitution sets that every 10 years, we do what's called a census. 1, 2, 3, there are 100,000 people in Alabama. And what that does is it does 2 things. Number one, that population number allows us to determine the direct taxes that state's going to pay. But more importantly, for our discussion of the 3/5 compromise, it determines the representation they get in the House of Representation. How many congressmen they are going to be able to send to Washington, D.C. to represent the interest of that state. And the controversy occurs not between small states and large states, but between southern states and northern states, and specifically on how do we count slaves. And the South wants it 2 ways. Number one, when it comes to counting slaves, they don't want to count them when it comes to direct taxes. They want to make sure that they are treated as property then, because the more population have, the more the direct taxes you're going to pay, and that's going to hurt them. But when it comes to representation, suddenly the South's like, slaves are people, because the more pop you get, the more rep you get, and the more power you get in Congress. And the North is like, hell no, slaves don't count. Slaves don't count because the more slaves, the more power, and we don't have any slaves. So at the end of the day, the fraction that you get, and I'm getting nauseous as I get ready to say the word, is the 3/5 fraction compromise. For every 5 slaves, when we do the census, we're going to count like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3. 6, 7, 8, 9, 6. For every 5 slaves, you get 3 people. And those people can be counted for your census, your population, and you can get representation off them. So the ironic part of this is that the South is going to get representation from their slaves so they can send that representation to Congress in order to keep their slaves slaves. Now, if we never had the 3/5 compromise, there's a good chance that a lot of American history would be different. Thomas Jefferson probably wouldn't have won the election of 1800. The Indian Removal Act probably would not have happened. Andrew Jackson would not have been able to veto the National Bank. We probably would not have had our compromises that pushed the Civil War off for another 50 or 60 years. So the 3/5 compromise is pretty darn important when it comes to understanding not only the Constitution and the Convention and compromise, but also really, I believe, sectionalism and the Civil War. So there it is, the 3/5 compromise. We're going to say it again. For every 5 slaves, you get 3 people in the census. First, for direct taxation purposes to determine how much taxes your state pays, but more importantly, to determine your pup for your rep for Congress, the House of Representation. Of course, the 3/5 compromise is going to be bye-bye, baby. When it comes to the 13th Amendment, that's going to nullify and kind of scratch out the 3/5 compromise. But now your brain's a little bit bigger than when you press play. So giddy up for that. Make sure that you check out other videos. We have over 250. And if you haven't subscribed, you should probably subscribe so you can get the latest updates. We put videos out all the time. And you know what I'm going to say if you watched me before. Where attention goes, your energy flows. We'll see you next time, guys. Giddy up, giddy up, giddy up, giddy up, giddy up.
All right, let me stop Hip Hughes here. He does a good job. He's got a series of videos, and we may use some of those as we continue our work here. 2 points. He mentioned power again, and again, I use that term in my opening. And when we think about the institution of slavery, we have to understand that it again was a method, a weapon of power used by people who could, wealthy enslavers who enslaved other men, women, and children for their own profit. The other interesting, he mentioned the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery after the Civil War in 1865. I said that the 3/5 compromise or clause was perhaps the most important, but there are 4 or 5 others that we'll cover before we finish. But you'll notice as you read the Constitution, as you consider these protections for enslavers built into the Constitution, nowhere does the document refer to slaves or slavery. If we read the language from Article 1 of the Constitution, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years and excluding Indians not taxed 3/5 of all other persons. Interesting, that reference to 3/5 of all other persons. The founders could not bring themselves to mention slavery or the enslaved or slaves in any part of our Constitution. More on that when we get together the next time, and I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.